morning, everybody. I'm also very happy to see you all here and hope that you'll have a very interesting day. Dr. Ali reminded you about the cell phones. Our lectures will be 20-25 minutes, and there will be plenty of time for questions and answers. There will also be an opportunity for people who are watching live stream to ask questions. Okay. The first panel is entitled U.S. Policy After the Election, A Reason for Change. Now that President Obama has been re-elected, our panelists will discuss whether we will see him maintaining similar policies or making significant adjustments in the U.S. policy towards the actors in the Middle East. I will introduce the three speakers now for the sake of time and efficiency. Our first panelist is Hrair Balian, who is the Director of Conflict Resolution at the Carter Center. Mr. Balian currently oversees the program's efforts to monitor conflicts around the world and coordinates the center's cross-program efforts in the Middle East. In addition to teaching an advanced international negotiation seminar at the Emory University Law School. The second panelist is Mr. Mark Perry, an American author specializing in military, intelligence, and foreign affairs analysis. In addition to his numerous articles in leading publications, Mr. Perry formerly co-directed the Conflict Forum based in Washington, D.C., London, and Beirut, specializing in engaging Islamic movements in the Levant in dialogue with the West. And our final panelist is Ms. Helena Cobban, a British-American writer and researcher on international relations, with special interests in the Middle East, the international system, and transitional justice. Ms. Cobban founded a new book publishing company in March 2010, and by September of this year, Just World Books had published 12 titles on current foreign policy issues. Ms. Cobban has also published widely in other media on 3 continents. Please join me in welcoming our panelists and inviting Mr. Balian to speak first. Thank you.
Thank you. I was asked to speak today as the first panelist on expectations from the U.S. administration with respect to the Arab awakening countries. On this front, the expectations can be brighter than in the case of the elephant in the room, that is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, in which the U.S. administration's past record and the expected record in the second term administration. The past record has been dismal. The expected record in the new administration, in my view, cannot be much better. What I propose to do in the few minutes available to me is to outline President Obama's promise when he took office in 2009, promise in the case of the Middle East, obviously, his performance in the past 4 years, and what can be expected based on this performance. And I start with President Obama's Cairo speech, seminal speech in June of 2009, where he promised to open a new chapter in relations between the U.S. and the Muslim world, and by extension, the Arab world. He said, and it's worth to remind ourselves, I've come here to Cairo to seek a new beginning between the U.S. and Muslims around the world, one based on mutual interest and mutual respect, and one based upon the truth that America and Islam are not exclusive and need not be in competition. Instead, they overlap and share common principles of justice and progress, tolerance and the dignity of all human beings. End of quote. More specifically, President Obama promised not to turn his back to the legitimate Palestinian aspirations for dignity and a state of their own. He promised that the U.S. will welcome all elected, peaceful governments, provided they govern with respect for all their people. He promised that the U.S. will protect religious freedom, will partner with any Muslim majority country to support expanded literacy for girls and employment for women, employment opportunities for women. And he promised that the U.S. will invest in education in the region and he would seek a broader engagement with the region beyond oil and gas. While he also addressed the problem of violent extremism in all its forms, he promised to partner with Muslim communities to combat such manifestations. Now for the deeds and the record. With the exception of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where the administration's record, as I said, is dismal, I agree with those who say that President Obama's administration has done a much better job in the Arab transition countries than he's been credited for. The administration has engaged behind the scenes with all actors, including the military, the Muslim Brotherhood, the liberals and beyond, trying to keep the transition on track, the transitions on track. The Romney folks have accused President Carter of leading from behind. I'm sorry, what did I say? A few years behind time, sorry. That's nonsense, of course. The administration has remained engaged with a light footprint in Egypt and Tunisia from the outset, and in Libya once Gaddafi was ousted. However, the administration has failed to push friendly, quote-unquote, friendly regimes such as Bahrain, Kuwait, and Jordan to enact serious reforms before their political crisis spiral out of control. In countries where transition has been violent, such as in Syria, Yemen, and Libya, at first, the administration's record has been mixed. In the period ahead, the new administration is likely to continue the cautious, pragmatic, and behind-the-scenes approach of the past 2 years as they wind down the war in Afghanistan, as the administration winds down the war in Afghanistan, as they struggle to manage the standoff with Iran, and as they struggle to address the civil war in Syria. Would President Obama take risks in the Middle East in the second term to secure a place in history for himself, as some have predicted? Frankly, I doubt it. That is not his style, that has not been his style, and that is not to be, I doubt it would be his style in the second term. Time does not allow us to examine in detail the administration's record in each of the Arab awakening countries. But in 2 countries, Egypt and Syria, where transitions have followed opposite paths, one peaceful and the other obviously violent, the administration's record to date and their likely engagement in the period ahead deserve a closer look because of the impact both these countries and the course of events in the next years in those countries would have on the rest of the Arab world. First, let's take a closer look at Egypt. In terms of the record of the administration for the past 2 years, initially President Obama's response to the uprisings was cautious and calculated. Perhaps I should say hesitant. Ultimately, President Obama supported the popular movement and called for Mubarak to step down. And ultimately, that's within a few days after the movement started, frankly. On the economic front, since February 2011, Obama has proposed plans for U.S. engagement with Egypt, which include $2 billion to fund private investment, $1 billion in debt relief, $1 billion in loan guarantees for infrastructure and job creation. And currently, the administration is involved in supporting a $4.8 billion loan being negotiated between Egypt and the International Monetary Fund. One contentious issue between the U.S. and Egypt has been the way in which Egypt has treated half a dozen U.S.-based non-governmental organizations and their activities in the country in 2011 and early 2012. As a result of this controversy, Congress had frozen the $1.3 billion U.S. aid to the Egyptian military, which was then released after the U.S. NGO representatives were released from jail and allowed to leave the country earlier in the year. And then Secretary Clinton released the funds, and they were transferred to Egypt. But equally and more importantly, on the political front, true to the Cairo speech promise, the Obama administration avoided the knee-jerk reaction of the American or the Bush administration in 2006 when another branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Hamas, won the Palestinian parliamentary elections in the occupied Palestinian territory. Wisely, they avoided this kind of approach, and they engaged very early on with the Muslim Brotherhood following their parliamentary elections, and continued to do so following the presidential win of Morsi in June of this year. Also significant, the administration pressed the military, the SCAF, to give up governance functions in June of this year and transfer all executive authorities to the elected government and elected president. Now, obviously, the transition in Egypt is still incomplete. A new constitution is being drafted as we speak. Probably a full draft would be released within the next 2 weeks or so. That's what President Morsi expects. When we met, I had the privilege of traveling with President Carter 2 weeks ago in Egypt and meeting with President Morsi. And he was expecting to have a new draft out despite all the difficulties and controversies surrounding court decisions on the process of drafting this constitution. And he expects to put this new constitutional draft to popular discussion for a month, and then immediately after that a referendum will take place, a popular referendum will take place to approve the new constitutional draft. At least that's the plan. And following that, there will be parliamentary elections again in Egypt. It would be reasonable to expect that the Obama administration will remain engaged in this process, always from behind the scenes, nudging Egypt to adopt an inclusive and tolerant constitution and complete this democratic transition. But the key for this transition to be successful will also depend on the economic issues. Egypt is in a very, very difficult economic condition. It has used up much of its foreign reserves. Direct foreign investments have dried up. Unemployment has shot up. And the government is being forced to increase the subsidies to consumer goods that it has paid in the past and continues to pay today. The Obama administration can be expected to ensure that the new Egypt will continue to honor, and the final point that I would expect, that the Obama administration would be expected to ensure that the new Egypt will continue to honor its treaty obligations with Israel. That is Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty. Although there are some voices in Egypt calling for a renunciation or a major revision of this treaty obligations, those are very isolated voices, and the intention of the Morsi administration in Egypt is to, at least the stated intention, is to continue honoring its treaty obligations with Israel, though they may negotiate with Israel revisions on some aspect of the treaty, in particular the presence of larger presence of Egyptian military in the Sinai Peninsula. Thus, a pragmatic, moderate, and tolerant Muslim Brotherhood rule in Egypt can be expected to have a positive influence in the rest of the Arab world's transitions to democracy in the years ahead. However, this is not to ignore the pressure from more radical elements of the Muslim Brotherhood's rank and file, and more significantly, the ultra-conservative Salafist forces in Egypt. The struggle between the liberal, more moderate, I should say, not liberal, more moderate leadership of the Muslim Brothers in Egypt and the more radical rank-and-file Muslim Brothers and the Salafists would determine the course of events in Egypt in the years ahead, and also the course of events in the Arab world and the course that the Arab awakening would take in the Arab world in the years ahead. Now let's turn for a few minutes to Syria. For the past 20 months of the Syrian uprising, the administration has resisted very wisely pressure from many quarters, American, international, and Syrian, to support a wider military intervention in the country under one guise or another. Humanitarian intervention, safe havens, no-fly zones, arming the opposition, etc., etc. Wisely, they have resisted all these pressures. However, the administration, in my view, has deferred excessively to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey, regional powers who have poured, in my view, oil on the Syrian fire by financing and arming the military wings of the opposition, reinforcing their intransigence. In August of this year, the administration signed a covert directive authorizing clandestine support by the CIA and other agencies for the rebels, and has been stepping up support gradually ever since. Not much is known about this support, but in my view it is a slippery slope towards more military engagement in Syria, which is an unwise course. So in addition to this limited support to the armed opposition, the administration has been engaged in a futile effort to unite the hopelessly fragmented opposition by trying to buttress the Syrian National Council, and in the last week or two, a new outfit called the Syrian National Initiative. In my view, this effort will fail. The administration has also paid lip service to cooperation with the permanent 5 members, in particular Russia and China, of the Security Council, to arrive at a common position and a Security Council mandate for intervention on Syria. However, despite this lip service, reality has been disappointing. A case in point is the June 2012 communique issued at the conclusion of a meeting of the international community in Geneva, a meeting convened by the former special envoy of the UN and the Arab League, Kofi Annan. While the US and Russia agreed on this communique, a detailed roadmap for a political transition communique, the day after the communique was issued in Geneva, unfortunately the US torpedoed any possibility of cooperation with the Russian Federation, perhaps indicating disagreement within the administration now on how to deal with Syria. I think it behooves the administration in the new period to return to that agreement, find common language with Russia, and support the new envoy Lakhdar Brahimi in his efforts for a political transition. Otherwise, the country will descend further into chaos, bloodshed, destruction, and sectarian divide, infecting in the process neighboring countries, in particular Lebanon and Jordan. The second term Obama administration would do much better if it focused on a UN Security Council mandate under Chapter 7 rather than how to strengthen the opposition to defeat the Assad regime. Such a Chapter 7 resolution in the Security Council should call for an immediate ceasefire, UN peacekeeping forces 10 to 15,000 strong, a strict arms embargo on both sides, an interim transitional government, which was already agreed in the June Geneva communique, calling for this transitional interim government to have full executive powers and to be appointed, and this interim government to be appointed possibly by the UN rather than created through negotiations between the regime and the opposition, which would never take place. What would happen to Assad was left open. President Assad was left open in the June agreement. But when the agreement called for full executive powers to be transferred to this interim government, obviously it is also calling for Assad at the very least to step aside, if not to step down. And to continue insisting that Assad stepping down should be a precondition for anything else to happen in Syria, I think is counterproductive. The formula found in the Geneva communique should be revived and implemented for the country to move forward. Well, I agree that all of this is easier said than done. But it is really the only way forward and the only way away from further militarization of the conflict, if that could be imagined at this point. Because the current stalemate between the two sides cannot be broken by force alone. And if it is broken, then the outcome is likely to be even more chaotic. To conclude, the Middle East since the Arab awakening has been full of challenges, obviously, each requiring a tailor-made policy. How the second-term administration react to these unfolding events in the two countries, I try to detail, will have an impact on developments in the rest of the region. And how the new administration addresses the elephant in the room, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, will be the defining characteristic of President Obama's legacy in foreign policy. There are two other issues that I haven't touched on. That is Iran. Somebody else will address that. And the drone war in the region against terrorism. And that's a whole nother subject, I'm afraid. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mark Perry. Nice to see you. I love being here. This is the second time I've been at this conference, and I love doing this because it gives me an opportunity to talk bluntly. 4 days ago, the American people, in their wisdom, re-elected a Kenya-born socialist, Arab apologizing, community organizing, terrorist affiliated, President of the United States. And the more they described him thus, the more I couldn't wait to vote for him. And I say this with some pride as a lapsed Republican. And so I've been asked this morning to talk about what we might expect in a second term from a man who in his first term said he would do something about the Palestinian-Israeli problem, and then proceeded to do absolutely nothing. And I hope you won't mind if I tell a story about the past before talking about the future. And it's a somewhat personal story. So if you'll bear with me, and also give me the liberty of believing what I am telling you. I'm going to talk about a two-state solution in the context of the Second Intifada, which I witnessed. As I recall, in 1994, sitting here in Washington, as Mr. Arafat, whom I knew personally, came to Washington to sign the Oslo Declaration, or the Washington Declaration, and I was seated with Itamar Rabinovich, the Israeli ambassador to the United States, when Mr. Arafat showed up, and was having a discussion with him, and there on the TV was Arafat getting off the plane, and I was beside myself. I thought, finally, couldn't believe it. Yasser Arafat in Washington. And I was very emotional. And Itamar Rabinovich looked at me and he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I never thought I'd see this day." And he said, "You're getting emotional." And I said, "Well, yes, I am." And he said, "Oh, my friend, listen to me carefully. This is only the beginning. This is the beginning of a long process. And here's what's going to happen. The Palestinians are going to sit down and they're going to tell us their story. And we're going to sit down and we're going to tell them our story. We're going to exchange national narratives. And it's going to take a long time. It might take 100 years. And sometime the exchange of that stories will be accompanied by gunfire. So get ready. This is only the beginning. And he was right, and I was wrong. And over a period of the next 10 years, from 1994 until the beginning of the Second Intifada, here's what happened. Arafat made the following deal. In exchange for coming back into Jericho and Gaza, he promised he would provide the Israelis with security. He would hire Palestinian security forces, which he would bring in with him, to arrest Palestinians. And in exchange, he would get land and governance, slowly but surely. That was the deal. That was Oslo. Because I asked him what the deal was, and he laid it out. And then, one day, Mr. Clinton called him and said, come to Camp David and meet with Ehud Barak, and we'll sign the final resolution of this conflict. And as Mr. Arafat said during the Second Intifada, when I asked him, how did this mess start? He told Mr. Clinton, I'm not going to come. I think this is a bad idea. My people aren't ready. I haven't consulted with Mr. Mubarak. I haven't consulted with the King of Jordan. I haven't prepared my people. Hamas is opposed to this. I haven't called the PLO Executive Committee. I haven't had the proper meetings. Now's not the time. And Mr. Clinton said, I insist, come anyway. He said, Mr. President, I just don't think this is going to work. He said, well, Mr. Clinton insisted. And I said, well, that doesn't really tell the story about the Second Intifada, Mr. Arafat. And he said, listen, here was the deal. And he explained it to me very vividly over a series of meetings. He said, you have a lady who has blinders on with the scales. And I said, yeah, the scales of justice. He said, and she has, yeah, scales of justice, and they're even. I said, that's right. He said, well, we have those scales, but they're not even. The Israelis have a military. We don't have a military. The Israelis have a good economy. We don't have a good economy. And the Israelis have the United States of America, and we don't. He said, so here was the deal. I would provide the security for Israel. But at key moments in our agreement, I could pick up that phone, this was in his office, and I would call the President of the United States, and I'd say, Mr. President, I'm in trouble. They're building settlements, they're shooting Palestinians, call the Prime Minister of Israel and balance those scales. Please, I need this, or I need this. I can't arrest this guy. I need this guy to come in from the outside. And the President of the United States, Mr. Clinton, would call the Prime Minister of Israel, and he'd say, Mr. Arafat needs help. Please, help him. And the Prime Minister of Israel would do it, and those scales would be balanced, because the United States would weigh in and balance those scales. And I counted on that. It was the only thing that was going to make Oslo work. And I kept arresting those people and putting them in jail, Palestinians, because I had trust that the United States would balance those scales. You with me on this? Makes sense, yes? This was Arafat's explanation to me. He said, so I went to Camp David. And we worked through Camp David, and I'm not surprised, as he told me, it didn't work. And I left Camp David, and Mr. Clinton promised me he wouldn't blame me for leaving. And I went to Taba, and we came close. But it still wouldn't work, and he blamed me, and I came home here to Palestine, and Mr. Sharon marched on the Temple Mount. I was in Jerusalem the night before Mr. Sharon marched on Temple Mount, the night of September 29th, 2000. The Palestinian Authority had a 9.2% growth rate. 9.2% growth rate. The hotels were full. The roads were paved. People had jobs. The ministries were humming. Sharon marched on the Temple Mount, and within the next week, there were riots, and protests, and 56 Palestinians died under Israeli gunfire. And as Arafat told me, he said, the pressures were enormous. So I picked up the phone and I called the president. I said, Mr. President, you've got to do something. Please call the Prime Minister of Israel and rebalance the scales. And Mr. Clinton said, no, sir, I won't do it. And Arafat looked at me and said, so I took the keys to the jails and I unlocked the doors and I rebalanced the scales. That was the Second Intifada. Now, I abhor violence and you abhor violence, but those are the facts of life. Force and politics work hand in hand. My argument here is that nothing has really changed since those days. Here's where we are in the West Bank. Israeli settlements are booming, and the Palestinian people are quiescent. And we know, and it's a fact, and go check, the only time in Palestinian history when settlements haven't been booming is when Israelis have been dying. And Palestinians know that. And it's bubbling in the West Bank. Now here's part two of the story, and then I'll sit down. And it doesn't seem to be related, but it is. We just had a national election. And I sat up until 4 o'clock this morning, and I'm starting to feel it. Studying the returns from 3 counties in Florida, Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach. There are 514,000 American Jews in those 3 counties. It's the 5th largest population of American Jews in the world. And they voted 70% for Barack Obama and 30% for Mitt Romney. Wrap your brain around this. If this had been the 2000 election and not the 2012 election, Mitt Romney would have carried Florida, not Barack Obama. You see what I'm saying? Remember, George Bush carried Florida and Palm Beach County in a contested election by carrying the Jewish vote by some 21% in 2000. So if Romney had carried Florida with 30% of the Jewish vote, it'd have been a very much different election, except for the following. If Romney had carried Florida this time, it wouldn't have mattered. And Obama would have won the election anyway. So the Jewish vote in Florida wouldn't have counted because Florida wouldn't have counted. Okay, next, New York State. There are 1.9 million American Jews in New York State, the second largest population of American Jews in the world outside of Tel Aviv. 980,000 of them, by my reckoning, voted in the election. 70% of them voted for Barack Obama, let's suppose. Right? Let's suppose 95% voter turnout in the Jewish American community. Let's suppose further what didn't happen actually happened, that 100% of Jewish Americans in New York City, in New York, voted for Mitt Romney and Barack Obama. Barack Obama would have still carried New York and would have won the election. So here's the deal, ladies and gentlemen. This was a really important election. Really important. Because AIPAC's promise to Israel is that Jewish Americans will vote for Israel, and that the third rail of American politics is Israel, and that the United States of America can't impose peace on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict because it means imposing peace on Israel. And doing so is political suicide. Well, guess what? This last election shows that's not true. That's not true. A J Street, you remember them, the enemies of Israel. That is to say, a pro-American, Jewish American organization. A J Street survey said that Jewish Americans vote on the following issues in order of importance: the economy, Medicare and Social Security, the deficit, taxes, and education. Number 6, Israel. Josh Mandel in Ohio ran on the rather dubious platform that Barack Obama had thrown Israel under the bus and was an enemy of Israel. Why this would matter to the out-of-work auto workers of Toledo and Akron is a puzzle to me, but it didn't work, and it's never going to work again. So here's my message to you and to Barack Obama. He can do this. We give $3.5 billion in aid to a country that is running a budget surplus, sitting on a well of natural gas, and has an unemployment rate of 6.9%, that we provide 1/4 of their defense needs. And here's his message: you will come to an agreement with the Palestinians, or you will defend your country with little red wagons. So do it. Thank you very much.
Well, I got 2 hard acts to follow. It's great to be back here. Thank you to Yusuf and everybody here at the Jerusalem Fund for holding this really timely conference. I am Helena Cobban. I am the owner of Just World Books, and I just want to tell you our latest book is Wrestling in the Daylight by Rabbi Brant Rosen. The subtitle is A Rabbi's Path to Palestinian Solidarity. The reason I mention this right now is that Rabbi Brant Rosen is coming to Washington, D.C. in early December. My good friend Grace Said is helping to organize that. So we got flyers outside if you're interested in trying to gather people to come and listen to Rabbi Brant. That would be really fabulous. We also have a super list for 2013, so go to our website, www.justworldbooks.com, and you'll learn all about it. I want to applaud my friend Hrair Balian for his great presentation, and just to add to what he said, let's not forget that there are more than 500,000 stateless Palestinians in Syria who are caught in the meat grinder of this violence, as we know. And I think that all of us here at the Palestine Center need to remember that. Stateless Palestinians, most of them Muslims, many of them Christians, and the communities being torn apart by this violence. Another reason for us all to care and to try to ramp down the violence. When I was thinking, what can I write, what can I say here this morning, I was thinking, well, if I was still writing my column for the Christian Science Monitor in 800 words, what would I write today? Luckily, I have more than 800 words, but I think I need to speak a little fast, so I shall do anyway. And what I would have done is, first and foremost, call on our newly re-elected President Barack Obama to be bold. Now is the time to be bold. I don't know how many of you read David Ignatius's excellent column yesterday, in which he recalled that after Johnson was elected for the first time, as you recall, when his first term was after the assassination of Kennedy, that he said, right now that I have been elected for my second term, effectively, I'm going to take major steps. What is the presidency for? Ditto. President Nixon went to China 1972, right after his re-election. He made the decisions beforehand, but he announced it and did it right after his second term started. Leaving your bold moves to the end of a second term, so-called bold moves, is what President Clinton did on the Middle East. It's what President George W. Bush did on the Middle East. And we know how catastrophic, both how damaging for peace both of those abortive attempts were. So President Obama needs to be bold, and he needs to be bold now on this issue if he is to have the kind of mark that he can on the history of the region. Of course, there are many issues that he needs to deal with immediately. I had a list somewhere. Anyway, obviously the first one is the fiscal cliff. Then we've got Iran and we've got Syria. That's right, I think I remember them all. But Israel and Palestine has to be right up there. It is related to fiscal matters in many different ways. One is that it is the cause of so much anti-American feeling in that important region of the world and worldwide that it feeds our need for defense and therefore the defense budgets. If we can resolve this issue, it's not that all our defense needs will suddenly be met through love and singing Kumbaya, but it will certainly help our strategic posture in this region and worldwide. So it is related to the fiscal cliff indirectly. It's much more directly connected with the issues in Syria and Iran. It cannot be left off the agenda if the president is going to be acting boldly. I want to look quickly at a couple of issues. The first is, what is this thing called the peace process? And the second one is to really unpack the nature of Israeli rule over the occupied Palestinian territories. And then I'll come back to this issue of what is it that we should call on our president to do right now at the dawn of his second term? So I've been thinking quite a bit about the peace process, not least because I'm married to a guy who wrote a book called The Peace Process, and we talk about it a lot. And I think that we have to look at the influence, in particular, of Dennis Ross in stressing the process rather than the results, which he has done ever since he was influential at the beginning and throughout the Clinton administration in the 1990s. Dennis had gotten it, I guess, from work he did in a minor capacity on confidence-building measures in the US-Soviet arena, which was actually his arena of such expertise as he has. He is not a Middle East specialist. Doesn't stop him being very influential. The effect of this stress on process, and in some cases, I would argue most likely in Dennis Ross's case, the intent of this stress was to provide a cover through endless going on and having things happen in the peace so-called process, and a conference here and a meeting there and a letter delivered here. The effect was to provide a cover for the continued building of illegal Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory. I can't stress that enough. This effect has continued throughout the past 39 years. 39 years, a period that I choose because it is the period in which the US has clearly dominated and monopolized the diplomacy on this issue. The last major significant international gathering at which there was another party involved was the Peace Conference, Geneva Conference in December 1973, right after the 1973 war. After that, Kissinger kidnapped the entire peace process, shut the Soviets out, shut out the Europeans when they tried to make a few little bleats in Venice in 1980, and the US has completely monopolized the peacemaking diplomacy such as it has been on this issue ever since 1973. There is, of course, now this thing called the Quartet, which is highly anomalous. Whoever would think that the United Nations would be subordinate to the US in an international body? Anyway, I needn't go on about the Quartet. But just bear in mind this whole thing called the peace process, and it always generates photo opportunities, news headlines, this, that, and the next thing. But meantime, what is happening is that the Israelis' matrix of control on the ground in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, continues and continues and continues. This is the nature of Israel's rule over the occupied Palestinian territories, precisely the spreading and sustenance of a matrix of control over the land and a matrix of, as we now know how to call it in this country, a matrix of disposition over the lives of the Palestinian residents. That is, they say who can come and who can go, who can visit, who can't visit, who can go to a hospital, who can't go to a hospital, who goes to jail, who goes to this bigger jail, which is Gaza, or who goes to that smaller jail, which is in Ashdod or somewhere else. Matrix of disposition and matrix of control. Plus, and this, of course, is why they do it, there is the continued implantation of an entire Israeli settler society into the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and control of the land and resources of the area. Now, before Oslo, when I would visit the West Bank, you'd see little isolated settlements, usually on hilltops, and the road system was Palestinian, and the settlers had to come and go. Sometimes maybe it would be a little scary for them, but they chose to go and live there illegally. After Oslo, the whole thing changed. After Oslo, the settlers got the road system with Arafat's express permission, and this was one of the fundamental flaws of Oslo. And the Palestinian cities and towns and villages became isolated enclaves with access to and between them completely controlled by the Israelis. Of course, I did grow up in England in the 1950s and 1960s at a time of decolonization by Britain and France, primarily, of the divesting ourselves of the colonies that we had had worldwide. I'll come back to that in a moment. But one of the major ways in which those colonial powers sought to maintain their colonial control over indigenous populations was precisely through movement control, through what in counterinsurgency is called quadrillage. You quarter off the land and then you make access going through very difficult, if not impossible. In the case of Kenya, it was particularly harshly applied. They had a whole system of prison camps called the Pipeline, in which terrible abuses occurred. I mention this because Barack Obama's grandfather was one of the people who was put into one of these camps and suffered most grievously. Right now, in the British courts, Kenyan survivors of that system of torture are winning their right to have a day in court for having been castrated by the British authorities in Kenya as part of that. Barack Obama needs to understand that this is a part of this whole phenomenon called colonialism. I'm sure he does at some very deep level. But what we need to understand that colonialism is precisely what is happening in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem right now. I think it's more useful as a discourse than the discourse about apartheid. I mean, apartheid is, in a sense, the South African authors of apartheid thought that, black South Africans could have some political rights somewhere, provided it was out there in the Bantustan, and gave them the pretense of independence for the Bantustans. This is more vicious. So I mentioned growing up in an era of decolonization in Britain. One thing that we knew was that maintaining that system of colonial control actually, once you've ripped off all the resources and everything like we did in India in the 19th century, it becomes a massive financial drag on the colonizing power. And that was why in the 1950s and 1960s, Britain and France gave up the colonies. Maybe there were some stirrings of conscience, but they were not what drove the decolonization. Israel today is the only colonial power in history whose system of colonial administration of the indigenous people of Palestine is fully funded by outsiders. American and European. And that was a marvelous benefit that they got from Oslo. Prior to Oslo, remember, they had to pay the costs of colonial administration themselves. But since Oslo, with the creation of this thing called the Palestinian Interim Self-Governing Authority, that was fully funded and has been since 1994 by external donors. Israel is the only country that not only doesn't have to pay the costs of colonial administration itself, but it actually makes a handy profit off it, because everything that goes in, whether it's cement or school books that goes into the PISGA areas, goes through Israel, and the Israeli traders and customs authorities take their handy percentage from it. So it's a modestly profitable venture for them to carry on having the EU and the US do this. The other great benefit that the Zionists got, and when I say Zionists, I mean people primarily in Israel who have a specific Zionist colonialist project, in particular in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. The other main benefit that they got from Oslo was, as I mentioned, that Oslo specifically allowed the building of the settlers' own massive transportation infrastructure, with the transformative effects that had on the human geography of the whole of the West Bank, and the ease with which entire settler communities can now drive to Tel Aviv, to Jerusalem, through Jerusalem, from Kiryat Arba, wherever they want to go. They've got their own roads, these things that are called apartheid roads. That was all specifically allowed by the Palestinian leadership in Oslo. So what's happened to this thing called the peace process with regard to the Palestinians? Oslo, as we may recall, ancient history, I was on that lawn too. It was amazing, I have to tell you, sitting on the lawn, in the White House lawn in September 1993, and seeing all these American Congress members and leaders of the American Jewish community who just the day before had been excoriating the PLO and saying we can never deal with them, they are terrorists. They turned on a dime the moment that Rabin concluded Oslo. And if you wanted an example of, what is the true nature of some of these organizations and the Congress, members of Congress that they buy and pay for, then that was the prime example. As it happens, actually, next year I'm going to be publishing M.J. Rosenberg's fabulous tell-all memoir of his times at AIPAC. So it's called AIPAC and Me by M.J. Rosenberg. Oslo was supposed to lead to the conclusion, if you read the text, of a final peace agreement by May 1999. It failed to. Thus, the body called the Palestinian Interim Self-Governing Authority, people forget that. They call it the Palestinian Authority as though it has some authority. It's a Palestinian Interim Authority whose term finished in May 1999. It became entrenched. People started to treat it as a government. It is not a government. In the West Bank, as Mark told us so vividly, it has continued to police the indigenes on behalf of the colonial project. So what should we who support peace, justice, and the equal worth of all human persons, what should we call on our own government here in the United States to do now? As I mentioned earlier, we need to urge our government to be bold, and to be bold in a speedy and timely fashion, not to leave it to the end of the second term. we need to recognize that it may be hard for any government to back out of many previous commitments that previous US governments, and actually President Obama himself, has made, however wrong-headed and actually in many cases illegal some of those commitments may have been. Let's look back, for example, at President Ronald Reagan's redesignation of the settlements as not necessarily illegal. He was kind of agnostic on the matter. But then fast forward to President George W. Bush's April 2004 letter to Sharon, in which he promised that the major settlement blocks, facts on the ground, or however he described them, could remain with Israel in the event of a final peace. Now, you know, all of those commitments are and changes of policy are, number one, illegal. Number two, they're not actually dispositive. You know, if Ronald Reagan can change the U.S. polity, the U.S. government's view of settlements from one thing to another thing, then another president can change them back. Say, actually, we've reviewed the international legal basis of this, and it turns out that the settlements are illegal. Why not? I mean, Ronald Reagan can switch it one way, and Barack Obama can switch it another way, because it actually happens that they are illegal. Everybody else in the international system agrees about that. Then there is the whole history of U.S. diplomatic engagement on this issue. As Mark pointed out, we have Clinton and his last-ditch effort, highly politicized effort, at a time when he was trying to help Ehud Barak's failing political fortunes, and failed at every level. But he did produce something called the Clinton Parameters. There were positions adopted by the US government at Annapolis and so on and so forth. Again, not dispositive. We don't have to say that policies have to stay in that track, in that misguided, misbegotten track. We can call for different policies. We need to be bold. Our government needs to be bold. The best course is we need to find something that we could surely demand based on our own principles as Americans that would move the policy in a good direction and that would be very hard for President Obama to explicitly reject. And I was trying to think, what should our call be for? And here's what I came up with. I'd obviously be delighted to have other suggestions and get into a discussion. I think we should call for our administration to state clearly and very soon two things. Firstly, that it will work for the speedy conclusion and implementation of a final peace agreement, not a process. Let's ban the word process. I mean, the whole theory of this, confidence-building measures thing is that by having these prior discussions, side discussions, back-channel discussions, you build confidence. It hasn't happened. It has destroyed confidence over the course of the, how many years, 15, 20 years since Oslo. It has massively destroyed confidence on both sides. So let's do away with that whole idea of a process being worth anything. It's the peace agreement that we need. It is 13 years overdue. If not, actually, 45 years overdue, but we can look at that a little bit later. This peace agreement, moreover, this is what the second call we should make from our government. The peace agreement and all other actions of the government should be based on the requirements of international law. And the US government will work with all relevant parties to ensure this. Does this sound terrifically radical? It shouldn't. I mean, there is no other area of foreign affairs in which stressing, compliance with international law would be considered radical. But in this case, it is. It makes me seem like some kind of wild-eyed, bushy-haired outsider. But people, international law is there for a reason. How long is it since we ever heard a US leader mention the concepts of international law and Israeli-Palestinian diplomacy in the same sentence? I can't remember it. Then I was thinking, what kind of bold actions might the president take that would change the dynamics and change the balance? One thing I thought, I'm actually, as it happens, just working on Ambassador Chaz Freeman's collection of writings about China, which we're about to publish. He was President Nixon's interpreter during that breakthrough meeting in Beijing with Chairman Mao in 1972, April 1972, I think. And it's a wonderful compendium, but just think of the boldness of Nixon doing that. I mean, prior to his re-election, up until that point, he had been, one of the most anti-Yellow Peril, anti-Chi-Com, anti-all that. But he was the one who said, look, we need to resolve what's happening. And it was actually mainly to do with troubles that they had in Vietnam, but also, a move in the global balance of power against the Soviet Union. We need to actually reach out and include the Chinese communists. So he went to Beijing. I think we should demand or require or ask our president to go to Jerusalem, where he would have two meetings. One would be with the Israeli Foreign Ministry or the Knesset in West Jerusalem, and the other, and he should obviously insist upon this, would be with elected Palestinian parliamentarians in Orient House. And that would certainly send a powerful message. East Jerusalem is occupied. Everything that the Israeli colonial powers have done to change the so-called facts on the ground in East Jerusalem is illegal, null and void under international law. If there is to be a viable two-state solution, I'm not sure that it's still possible, but, if there is to be one, then East Jerusalem will have to be the capital of the Palestinian state. And under those circumstances, West Jerusalem can be the capital of the Israeli state. But anyway, the idea of visiting East Jerusalem, I think it would be a super one, and not just to do the Rahm Emanuel thing of going under Israeli police and military escort to the Wailing Wall, which is also part of East Jerusalem, and to say some prayers there. Although prayers would not be a bad idea. Okay, I recognize that President Obama has other priorities, as I mentioned at the beginning, but this one is huge and can affect everything else. 380 million people in the Middle East, I'm not counting North Africa, anything west of Egypt, 380 million people in the Middle East all care deeply about this issue. Of these, less than 8 million are Israeli citizens. Do we actually uphold the equality of all human persons in the region by continuing to base our policy on the claimed needs of this tiny minority in the region? I'm not calling for the legitimate interests and concerns of the Israeli citizens to be overridden, but neither do I think it is either right or sustainable for the legitimate interests and concerns of the other 372 million people of the region to be ignored, including among that the legitimate rights and interests of 10 million Palestinians worldwide, and the concerns of all the people around the world, many billions of people, for peace in this region. So I think that our president has a unique opportunity. He needs to take it now, and if he can't do it now, and if he just fritters away this immense political capital that he has accrued on talk about a peace process somewhere down the line, then he will be making a massive mistake, and he will certainly be digging the final coffin for the two-state solution and thus for a Jewish state in Palestine. Thank you.
My name is Jamil Faiz. I'm a physician and a professor of medicine. I was very impressed with the three speakers, no question about that. Mr. Perry, I have a question. You implied bluntly, but it was an implication, that no more Israeli lobby, no more AIPAC. It is not going to work anymore. The question is, does the administration realize what you realize? Number one. The other question is for Mrs. Cobban. You said the president has to do something between two rivals, the Israelis and the Palestinians. The Israelis are colonizers. Everybody in the world knows that. Everybody decides that, except, unfortunately, the PA. The Palestinian Authority collaborates with them, helps them, make sure they build the fence. So how can a president make peace between somebody who is colonizer and somebody who is collaborating with the colonizer? Abbas is collaborating with Israel more than the Israelis.
Yeah, we'll take one question at a time, so please, the panelists will remember. Please use the mics, gentlemen.
The answer to your question about whether the administration knows that the Israel lobby, in virtue of this election, has been defanged on the third reel, de-electrified, is I don't have a clue. But yeah, they know. And the reason I know is because this is the dog that didn't bark. I'm an absolute junkie for the last 4 days on this election. And if there was one thing that people didn't talk about on CNN, ABC, NBC, CBS, it was the Jewish vote in America, which is what consumed the airwaves in the post-2000 election because it counted. Doesn't count now. And it's extraordinary to me how all of a sudden no one's talking about it. Why is that? Well, everyone's talking about the Hispanic vote.
I would just add on that question that everybody who was at the Democratic National Convention in Charlotte, North Carolina, saw something amazing happen. Unprecedented, that the Democratic Party base, the organized part of the Democratic Party base, refused for 2 or 3, actually they never gave the party leadership the support they needed on that platform point of including Israel. They had to completely fudge that vote.
The nays had it.
Yeah. And if you haven't seen that, that's amazing. And everybody in the party leadership saw that. On this question of how our government or anybody else can make a deal between the colonizer and the colonized, I just want to recall that obviously it's not the PA that negotiates, it's the PLO. The PA is an out-of-wedlock child that the PLO had at Oslo. And maybe, you know, it sounds a little like how many angels can dance on the head of a pin to make a distinction between the two. But the PLO supposedly represents all Palestinians everywhere. And the more there is mobilization of Palestinians in the diaspora, including under this great initiative from Dr. Ghada Karmi and others, the more that Palestinians in the diaspora will get the representation they deserve in the PLO. So that's part of the answer. Is there a deal to be made between the colonizer and the colonized? You know, I mean, I would see every week on the BBC, actually we didn't have a television, but okay, every month when I went to the Pathé newsreel, on, you know, you'd see like Jomo Kenyatta, who 2 weeks before had been in prison and excoriated as a terrorist, and suddenly it's President Kenyatta, and they're hauling down the Union Jack and hauling up the new flag. That is always negotiated. The end of colonialism is always negotiated at the very end, and it can be for the occupied Palestinian territories as well.
Hrair?
Just one comment on the Jewish vote in these elections. That's quantifiable. How do you quantify the Christian Zionist vote, which was also which is a significant factor in the elections, and on which AIPAC relies?
It's quantifiable, and it will carry, and it has carried, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Tennessee,
Georgia,
Oklahoma, Kentucky. They can carry them for the rest of the century. They're welcome to them. You know, the Democratic Party is thinking about the unbreachable firewall of 243 electoral votes, in which there's a very minuscule Christian evangelical Israel supporting vote. And they'll get 243 electoral votes every single election unless the Republican Party starts to shift its views on the major issues of America, on fiscal policy, women's issues, and immigration, none of which have anything to do with Israel. That's it. The Republican Party is sitting there today wondering, after thinking they were going to actually win this thing, what they're going to do about alienating women in this country and how they're going to get their vote back. That's what happened here. Didn't have anything to do with Israel. That's the issue. That's my sense of this.
Dr. Ramadan? Take the mic, please.
Yeah, I was born in Jerusalem, and my father's house and my house is still occupied by a Jewish family in Jerusalem. My question is mainly to Mr. Balian about the American policy. We claim that we are defenders of human rights. When Mr. Obama came, he promised to end the war, which was disastrous to the Middle East and to the United States, but he kept all the people in the Defense Department and continued the war. Mr. Obama's administration continued to support the dictators in the Middle East until few days before their fall, and he and his administration continued to support the cruel regimes in Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Morocco and the rest of the Middle East, and they kept a blind eye and a deaf ear and no heart to the Palestinian sufferings throughout Palestine, and I say proper Palestine, and in the diaspora. Is there any hope, which Mr. Obama talks about hopes, do we have a hope that the administration, the American administration, will read the history and the geography of the Middle East and change?
Any takers?
I mean, he addressed the question to me. I'm not sure why.
Thank you.
But
Good.
Yes.
I mean, in terms of the U.S. policies in the countries I spoke about, Egypt, Tunisia, the Arab awakening countries where the transitions have been peaceful. Yes, the administration came late to the changes and supported the changes. Better be late than never. I think the record is not so bad. The record of the administration is not so bad in those countries as I tried to detail. Now, in terms of Palestinian Israeli issue, in terms of the Palestinian issue, I agree with the speakers who addressed the issue, that the record of the administration has been dismal, promised a lot, as I think Mark said, promised a lot and didn't deliver anything. Had I been asked to speak on the subject, it would have been a very short statement that there's nothing that we can expect, I'm afraid, from the administration. But I'm very happy to hear. I was very happy to hear Mark's analysis as to why it behooves the administration to change its policy, and very happy to hear Helena's talk that bold action is what's needed. But I'm really concerned that bold action is not in the character of President Obama, has not been in the character of President Obama, and frankly, I just don't expect bold action from him on the Palestinian issue as well.
We have a question on Twitter,
Unfortunately.
then I'll go to the gentleman right here. What's the most effective thing Americans can do to support human rights in Palestine? And this is to the entire panel.
One thing I think we can and should all do is support the movement for boycott, divestment and sanctions, which rightly identifies ending the occupation as the central goal, because we as Americans know, because we have run military occupations in various parts of the world, both 50 years ago and more recently, that military occupation can never be the kind of system of rule that allows or fosters respect of human rights. It's military rule, but it's military rule by foreigners, which is even worse. So I think that's the first thing that we need to do, end the occupation, and as citizens what we can do is support BDS.
I mean,
Go ahead.
I must say that human rights in general has not been a forte of this administration. It just simply has not been. In fact, this administration has been one of the weakest U.S. administrations, Republican or Democrat, on human rights in general, the universal understandings of human rights. I mean, look at Guantanamo. Look at the indefinite detention of people. Look at targeted assassinations, including of U.S. citizens abroad. Look at, you name it, a whole number of issues in which this administration has dismally failed on promoting human rights. Instead of being an example in the world on of upholding and promoting human rights, it has done the exact opposite.
My daughter called me. My daughter worked for Sherrod Brown in Ohio, and she. Yes, well, wait till you hear this anecdote. And she called me and she said, "Dad, who'd you vote for?"
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "I voted for the guy who launched the drone attacks and taps my phone." So, I love these 25-minute speeches in Grant Park, but not really. Let's, we need to be a little bit realistic, and it behooves us to do, as my colleagues here said, let's hold this administration. I'm thrilled, and I applaud them. And these are wonderful speeches, but we need to hold this administration's feet to the fire.
I agree.
Very good. Gentleman right there, please.
You can call on some women, don't forget.
Okay. equal right place here.
Jerome Siegel, University of Maryland. I agree with Hrair with your conclusion before about it's unlikely that we should expect anything big from the Obama administration. And I think also that they'll continue to thwart anything important happening in the Security Council, and will continue probably to prevent the Europeans from taking a significant initiative also. So the question really is sort of, is there any arena in which something significant might happen? And I had a proposal, you may have read about it. There was an op-ed that I wrote with Javier Solana and Shlomo Ben Ami and Tom Schelling, which talked about going over the heads of the government, over the head of the Israeli government, going to the Israeli people, and going directly to the Palestinians. And it was based really on something that polling data seems to show, which if you look at the two peoples, there still seems to be a common core that makes one optimistic that a negotiated settlement is actually possible. And the idea would be to go to the one arena that actually has once before developed a plan for actually ending the conflict, and that's the General Assembly. And of course, the only time it did that was in '47 with the petition resolution. But it was a very detailed plan that produced a border and so on. And the idea would be, once again, without American approval, to go to the General Assembly, have them appoint a special commission that would have 2 terms of reference. It would be to come up with a treaty-level agreement that would have 2 terms of reference. One, it should be consistent with the Arab Peace Initiative. And secondly, it should be acceptable to majorities of both the Israeli people and the Palestinian people. And to go on, and then a lot of things could happen once it produced that. I'm just wondering what your reaction is to starting there as a UN action.
I saw this. I think that the principle of free, fair, and transparent elections in the Palestinian lands would for me be a starting point for negotiations between Palestinians and Israelis. I know it's hard to unring the bell on this, but there seems to have been some progress, and there will be further progress on talks between Hamas and Fatah on an agreement that will bring national reconciliation. And you don't have to have an agreement in order to have an election. You could have an election and then an agreement. Mm-hmm. And you could have a mandate for whoever wins that election. It would be Khalid Mashal. And Abu Mazen would be okay with that, to then negotiate with the Israeli government. And Israel would be actually okay with negotiating with Hamas, especially if the United States said, you will negotiate with whoever the winner is. And it seems to me that that's kind of a corollary to the idea that you would have, and that then both peoples would have to ratify the resulting agreement. I think that that's a possibility of a way forward. But I think that voting in democracy has to be a vital component of any negotiated settlement, or it won't work. It's not going to work. You can't come in and say, you win, you lose, sign here. The people, neither Israelis or Palestinians are going to accept that. That isn't a detailed answer to your proposal, but I studied your proposal. I thought it was very interesting.
I could just add to that I think it's true that elections or a democratic ratification process has to be a part of it, but that has to include diaspora Palestinians in some way, because it cannot be restricted to only that tiny proportion of the Palestinian people who are permitted by the Israelis to live in their homeland. I mean, so when people say the majority of Palestinians support this, they're measuring the Palestinians who are permitted by Israel to live in their homeland, which is not, and that goes back also to the partition plan, which has many attractive features, including, that it allows for freedom of movement between the two states, complete freedom of movement between the states, and an international and an economic and customs union between the two of them. Essentially, it would be a confederation. But the partition plan was not agreed on by the Palestinians at the time. So this time, if we're doing anything, whether it's based on the partition plan or anything else, yes, there has to be an act of ratification, and yes, that act of ratification has to involve the Palestinians who are not permitted by Israel to live in their homeland, just as it did in every conflict-ending agreement in modern history, from Cambodia to Mozambique to Bosnia to Iraq to Afghanistan.
And
exiles
the
have to be,
Palestinians would insist on it.
Yeah, have to be involved. Khalid Mashal, for example, would
Yes.
have to be involved.
Question from there, and then we'll have one question from Twitter, and the 11 o'clock coffee break. I'm sorry.
Let me
I'll let you answer
respond to that. I agree with the previous speakers that reconciliation is a precondition for any strategy by the Palestinians to move forward this to end the conflict with Israel. And unfortunately, we've had setback after setback on the reconciliation front in the last 6 months. And there is hope, though. And the hope is in Cairo. That is the role that the Muslim Brotherhood, and in particular President Morsi, can play in promoting Palestinian reconciliation. And it seems President Morsi and the Brotherhood are willing to weigh in on this and push forward Palestinian reconciliations. But unfortunately right now they've got their plate full with Egyptian issues, internal issues, the economy of the country. And until and unless they address these issues, they will not be able to really devote the time necessary and the energy necessary to push the reconciliation process.
Our government has to
accept
allow it to go ahead and not
yes.
block it as they did previously.
Yeah. And they are under, and the Egyptians are under pressure from the U.S. and Israel not to allow the reconciliation to move forward. And we know this from the horse's mouth, basically. Yeah.
One last question from there. I'm sorry if I interrupt.
Yeah, that's fine. Go ahead. No problem.
Andrea Morel Farsak, retired Foreign Service officer. One thing the Palestinians could do, and there's been a lot of discussion about this over the past several months, is dissolve the Palestinian Authority, thereby forcing the Israeli government to take responsibility again totally for the occupation. And I would like everybody on the panel, if that's possible, to comment on what the possible consequences of that might be in forcing action on the so-called peace process. And the other thing, if there's time, what, if anything, is the impact of the Emir of Qatar and now possibly the Prime Minister of Turkey going to Gaza on Hamas and on the reconciliation possibly between Hamas and Fatah? Thank you.
I think that the effects of the dissolving of the PA would be enormous and very welcome. Remember, it's still only just an interim self-governing authority, and this idea that it has some kind of legitimacy in the continuing way is bizarre, and it's part of this edifice of smoke and mirrors that is used to hide the continuing fact of colonial taking of Palestinian land. Of course, the Israelis have a huge interest in the PISGA continuing to exist, which is why every time there is a funding crisis or whatever, the Israelis give them just enough. I mean, they are providing wonderful services for the Israelis. Now, I've known Abu Mazen for, 30 years, maybe more. He's a decent, kind-hearted person, but I think his strategy is 100% wrong. I mean, as he described it to me back in Tunis in the 1980s, he said, you know, we're going to love them to death so that they, not love them to death, but hug them so tight that they can't avoid giving us our basic rights.
Wow.
And, you know, here we are 30 years later, and we see how much they have avoided. You know, there have to be political changes inside the PLO and inside Fatah, because this leadership, Abu Mazen's leadership, and the other, I hate to be ageist, but there is an age factor here. These are he and Abu Ala are the last two members of the historic founding leadership of Fatah, and they have systematically prevented the emergence of new leaders. So it's a real crisis for Fatah. They are not going to give up the perks and benefits and nice little contracts that their sons and their daughters-in-law get from, you know, this contract or that contract, and sending their children, you know, full scholarship to Harvard and whatever. All these little, I mean, if you just actually read the history of the Cherokee Nation in this country and see how the leaders there were bought off by, you know, having their children go to Harvard and such. It's exactly the same story, and at the end of the day, Andrew Jackson just tossed out the Cherokee Nation, like, go walk on the Trail of Tears. And I mean, I think that Abu Mazen could do something a lot more dignified than that if he were to resign.
Ulysses S. Grant told the Indian nations their real homeland was in Canada. I don't think that they're going to suspend the PA, and if they did, I do believe that we'd be moving closer to a third intifada. I don't think Abu Mazen is going to do that because the pressures from his bureaucracy are too great to do it. In answer to your second question, I believe that Qatar and Turkey have determined that the future leadership of the Palestinian people probably resides in Doha with Khalid Mashal and in Cairo with Musa Abu Marzouk. I think they've made that determination. I know that Turkey has. And that this is the credible alternative to what they view as a kind of weak and fossilized and discredited leadership in Ramallah that can't produce, you know, the truth of the matter is the Israelis wake up in the morning and call Abu Mazen weak and the PA weak and corrupt and not important and all these people. And they call the people in Gaza a terrorist entity, but they don't call them weak. And people notice that. So I think that's kind of the future, and sooner or later, you know, the Israelis don't talk to Hamas, but they sure do talk to them when they're in their prisons, and they talk to them very seriously.
I agree.